I personally have a base mod that I use for all of my mods, and I just modify it to fit my needs, which I'll put in the description. If you do download it from the description, skip this section. But if you are to start from scratch, and keep in mind these are the bare minimum for a plane to work, you generally need at the very least these directories: a main mod folder, name as you please, in which you'll place the mod.json file, and a data folder. Within that data folder, place an aircraft2 folder, a database folder, and a loadouts folder. Within each of those, you can steal JSONs from the main game for a base file for formatting and such. If you go into the data folder through Arena Data and Streaming Assets, you'll see there's also an aircraft2 folder, database, and loadouts folder in there. You're going to steal from these to make your base. In the aircraft2 folder, pick any plane you think fits closest with yours, i.e. I'm going for an Su-25, so I feel that F4E is probably the closest fit, and put its JSON into the aircraft2 folder and rename it to whatever your plane is. In the database folder, you're going to steal the aircraft.json and the loadouts, do the same as you did with the aircraft2 folder, copy and rename the same plane as before. Go back out to your mod's main folder and open up the mod.json and either type or copy this text and formatting, obviously substituting with your own plane's name and such. Also keep in mind that the name parameter is case sensitive and you'll have to use the same capitals and lowercase whenever you refer to the internal name of the plane from here on out. For starters, you need a plane. Now, whether you base it off an existing one, come up with your own, use an existing fictional aircraft, or a never-built prototype is all up to you. I'll be focusing on basing off a real craft for this whole section. In-depth data can be difficult to find on a majority of aircraft, but if you aren't going for realism, you could always fudge some values. I'm going to be using the Sukhoi Su-25 and its data from various sources. Scrolling down here are some specifications that we'll need. Now for the proper coding part. Opening the plane's JSON file in the aircraft2 directory and scrolling down a bit, you'll see there's a physics branch, and within some specifications. Some are self-explanatory and easy to find. The empty weight of the plane in kilograms, right here, and its fuel weight is just a Google search away. Do more research than this to verify, don't just use the first thing that comes up on Google. All speeds are in knots, and measurements are in meters. You can just go through and place what you need when you can find it. Moving down, you'll see engines, and for the internal names, I recommend no hyphens or anything fancy. You can see the power plant has 44.18 kilonewtons of thrust, and we'll input that in just newtons, so 44,180. If your plane has an afterburner, put that thrust under AB thrust. Mine does not, so I'm copying the same value and setting the has afterburner to false. Also notice that if you go down a little more, there are instances. Each of these is an engine. My plane has 2 engines, so I have 2 engines. But if yours has one, you simply delete the other instance, and you can set the name to whatever you want. Once again, mine has 2, so I am going to leave it as it is. Max speed dry is the maximum speed without afterburner, and max speed wet is the maximum speed with afterburner. Stall speed is one of those things you'll kind of have to dig around for, though from this I can see mine is likely a tad less than 130 knots, so I'm going to use 110 for now. Things like pitch, yaw, and roll rate are often very difficult to find. These I usually end up falling back on data from DCS for. For the G-limits, you technically should be using a turn performance or doghouse plot. These are fairly difficult to come by for craft that are even remotely unpopular, so I usually once again fall back on DCS for some values, but game-wise it's essentially how many Gs you are allowed to pull at any given speed, i.e. a G-limiter. Regardless, if you do come across one for your plane, here's the gist. You'll see something like this usually, sometimes without the G-curve, sometimes a different unit, sometimes if the G's is the Y-axis instead of turn rates. All you need to know is the graphed line, dashed in this example, is what you're looking for. you're looking for where it intercepts the G lines. So for this graph, at the very top, at 1,000 kilometers per hour, this plane can pull 9 Gs, and at both 1250 and 815, it can pull 7 Gs. You simply map what you can into the G limits list, and this will dictate overall how the aircraft handles. Once you have this area, the cruise speed, the countermeasures, and radar, whatever, all filled out with whatever values you need, all you gotta do is rename the plane from whichever you used, mine being the F4, to your plane's name. Keep in mind the internal name should be the same as in the mod.json file. And change the names in the loadout and database file. You can delete all the other craft in the database file as well. You then should be good to launch up the game and see your plane in the database. Typing only the Harrier on the main menu allows you to access all craft, meaning you can even test fly your plane. Don't crucify me, but I'm only going to focus on rigging your model up for use in-game. For an in-depth tutorial for modeling, I'll put a video by Top Fighter in the description. Rigging the model isn't terribly complex, though there are some core things to consider. The world origin will be the plane's center of mass, and all of your empties, or all of your points, have to be rotated so the Z is pointing forward. Keep in mind this is relative to the point, i.e. if you want the point or empty to point forwards, you point the Z forwards. If you want it to point left, you point the Z left, etc. Regardless, we're going to use an existing gear animation, the F4E's gear animation in this case, and ignore control surfaces to start just to save time and get the model in-game, and I'll cover control surfaces and custom gear animations later in the video. To start, add an empty with arrows and rotate it 90 degrees on the X, again, to point the Z forward. I just copy and paste this point over and over for when I need it. We'll do the pilot point first, place this at the base of where the pilot's seat will be. Then a cockpit camera point, this is where the head/eyes of the pilot are, where the camera will be. Then a flyby focus point, which is self-explanatory. Trust me, this will make the flyby camera significantly better. Then a left and right trail point on the backs of the wingtips. Engine effects points on the back of each engine, and typically you'd also add a nozzle interior, but I don't have an afterburner so I won't. You can look at the F4E's model for examples from the Unity file I'll cover shortly. Pylon points on the underside of each pylon, countermeasures, points on the end of each gun barrel, and a radar point if your plane has a radar. Landing gear I'm going to simplify for now, but it consists of an attachment point, a base or strut model, and a wheel. You can, and should, add other parts, but we won't worry about that for now. The attachment point needs to be directly above the wheel, essentially matching its X and Y. Also, because we're going to be using the F4E's gear animations for now, we'll need to name our gear bases the same as the F4's, being gear nose base, gear main base L, and gear main base R respectively. Also make sure the origin point for the landing gear is at the top of the base or where you want it to rotate from. As you can see, I'm just using sticks as placeholders and we'll call it here and come back to this later. For now, we'll try and get this in-game as is. Quick important side note, I forgot to record footage for this, but make some hitboxes around your plane and make them their own material. I name my material Collider Mat, and then also make a shadow for your aircraft using a plane and just make a low poly silhouette. Make sure to name the shadow model Shadow and make it its own separate material as well. Also make sure that where you put it, the X and Y are at the world origin. Z, it can be up and down anywhere, but you need to make sure that the origin of the shadow, its X and Y, match the world origin, otherwise it won't line up with your plane. Also make sure your shadow origin, the Z is pointing forward like you would for a normal point. Now we're going to go to the Tiny Combat Tools GitHub. I'll put a link for that in the description, but basically you're going to just download the Unity version right here, install that, and then download the zip from here and extract it somewhere, and you're done. If anything goes wrong, there's a mini tutorial on the GitHub and documentation for the tools you can follow as well, but it's pretty simple. Under the Assets and then Tiny Combat Tools folder, open the demo scene, or you may have to open it through the Unity Hub. But once it is open, you can go back to Blender, go to your model, go to the file, export, and export it as FBX using these specific settings. I personally have them saved, but be sure to have these settings or it just breaks things. Export the file into the mod, capital MOD folder that should have appeared in your Tiny Combat Tools /assets folder. Now you can go back to Unity, navigate to the mod folder in Unity, and just drag your model into the scene. It'll probably be in the ground, don't worry about it, just select the model in the left bar, and then click Select in the top right, and then go to Materials. From here you can see I have some duplicate palettes that I needed to get rid of and re-export the model. And then, reselect it to refresh the texture info. And from there, you can select each material and replace it with the corresponding material from the editor. Canopy and Collider Matte are self-explanatory, but make your shadow material shadow depth offset. We don't have material for the plane yet, so we'll just apply what we have now. And then go back in the File Explorer, under Assets, Tiny Combat Tools, Content, and then Examples. Go to the F4E and copy the F4E's material and just paste it into your mod folder. Rename it to your plane or whatever you want, and then copy the palette image you used during modeling into the mod folder as well. You can then select the material in Unity and change its texture image in the top right to your plane's palette. You can then reselect the plane, go to the materials, and replace the material with the one that you just created. Apply, and it should indeed be your plane with the red collider boxes around it. You can then go to the very top bar, and under Tiny Combat Arena, open the Asset Bundler, and select the path to export as your mods folder. You can see I already exported mine earlier and forgot to delete it, so I'll be replacing it, but make sure to give the file a unique name as it can cause conflicts with other mods if you don't. From here we jump back into coding. First thing, we open the mod.json and put in quotes the name of the assets file you exported under the assets list. Going back to your plane's aircraft 2 JSON, we want to swap the model path with the one from our asset list file. Then it's fairly straightforward of replacing the old with the new, replacing the old colliders with your new ones' names. The wing trail points, the pilot seats, the canopy meshes in this list are the ones that will be thrown when ejecting, FYI. Any engine effects points down here. This gear will have to make some changes to though. If you didn't just outright copy the landing gear from the original plane's model, you'll notice you don't have the collateral part. You can just quite literally delete that line and forget about it on all 3 parts of the landing gear. The hide meshes list is a bit tricky, especially if you don't have gibs, but for now we'll just empty it and only put the fuselage in there or whatever you named your fuselage object. It might cause errors later on, but we'll just deal with that later. Gib meshes we don't have right now, so we can empty that list or delete it entirely if you don't plan on making any. The damageable parts looks complicated, but you can just pop in the names of what hitboxes you have, and once again, not worry about it for now. The gun barrel, fire points, and eject points, you can plop whatever you made in the model. If your plane doesn't eject casings, you can just get rid of the case eject part entirely. Now the pylons and the stations, I simplified my pylons into a single model for all of them, and then 10 points, which you shouldn't do, but for time I did. So I'm going to leave all the mesh fields empty to prevent errors and just put the names of my pylon points into each attach point, adding more since 2 obviously isn't enough for the 10 that I have. From here, you should be good to simply save it, boot up the game, type only the area to unlock all the craft, and test it out. As you can see, it will almost always go awry, but these are easy fixes that you'll kind of have to learn over time. For example here, I had my collider names technically correct, but I didn't re-export changes I made to the model, so that was an easy fix. The afterburner being on was because there was no nozzle int in the model, so I just tell it the engine effects is the nozzle int, and it stops that. The landing gear was because I forgot the F4E's gear is parented to the attach points, etc., etc. These things will just come up, and you just kind of have to fix them as you go along. Also, I didn't record this, but my landing gear was really messed up. It's because my origins were A, in the wrong spot, B, I didn't apply the rotation, and C, they weren't even pointed forward. Doing all of those and then adjusting some things in the JSON, I'll cover it later, but it's mostly the gear offset from the origin of the strut to the center of the origin of the wheel. That's what you put in for the suspension root offset. That was wrong, and I had floating wheels. I tried to fix that here, and yeah. Well, you've got your plane and you want to pretty it up a bit more with some moving parts and custom animations. Gear is easy, but animating in Unity can be a hassle sometimes. Control surfaces are tedious, but also very easy. After replacing my placeholder gear, we're going to move straight back into the File Explorer. In the Asset Bundler folder, we're going to go under Example and F4E, and then we're going to copy the F4E animator and the Animations folder, and paste it into our Unity mod folder. We can then rename the controller and animation in the folder to replace the F4E with our plane. Now going back into Unity, we can double click on the controller and then click on the Gear Up node. Under Motion, replace it with the Gear Up animation you renamed, then you can rename the node as well. You can then double click on the animation file itself and it'll open up an Animator tab. I'm putting this in the main window just for ease of access. You usually want to be able to see what you're doing, so as long as you have the animation clip selected, you can just drag the plane's model from the left bar into the bottom right window and it'll show you a preview. Quick rundown: changing any value on the left keys that value in the animation on the keyframe you're under. Setting the game object is active to 0 hides that model. Obviously the rotation is a rotation part, yeah. In this instance, the SU-25 has its landing gear retract outward, while mine go inward, so I simply change the final rotation for both parts to reflect this. If you want to add more parts to the animation or do something other than rotate, you'll have to select the model in the furthest left bar, and add component on the right, and add animator, and then set it to your plane's animator. You'll then have the ability to add property, and you can choose an item or an aspect of it through the drop-down list. With this, I'm adding a translation portion for both the left and right gear to allow them to retract horizontally as they do on the real craft. I determined it looked ugly and weird, so I got rid of it, but hey, there's nothing wrong with trying. Whenever you're done fiddling with it, export it from Unity once more, and if you look into the Assets List document, you may notice that the new files aren't in that list. If they are, huzzah, but if not, you'll have to literally delete that text document and then re-export it, and it'll give you the new one with an updated list. You can then, in that document, just copy the animator.controller line and paste that into the animator path portion of your plane's main JSON at the top. You should then have some working landing gear animations. And finally, to finish things off, we're going to go over control surfaces. These are fairly simple to implement. You cut a hole in the wing, or cut a hole in the tail, or use the entire tail. Whatever. All you need to know is that on the axis of rotation, you don't technically need to do this, but it's what the main game Harrier does, so it's what I do. You get 2 points, stick them on each end where it'll rotate around, and then point the Z's of them at each other I personally do this by adding a constraint that's a track to, and I track them to each other. Name one of them, B aileron, the other one B aileron underscore end, parent the aileron model and the end to the original B aileron point, and you're done. That's it. You don't need to worry about that. You do that for each aileron, each flap, any moving surface you have. That's all you gotta do. Once you're done with that, you have to add an animated parts section. You can just copy this straight from the Harrier, either the entire section or just one part, and then duplicate that. But you can name it whatever you want, and name the part whatever you named the original point. So B aileron, you put B aileron as the part. You put your rotation axis, and then you can see how there's angle by roll or angle by pitch, and then whatever, just stick it in there, put the axis. If the axis is wrong, you just change the axis, 0, 0, 0 or 0, 0, 1. Change it to 0, 1, 0. If that's not the right one, then try 1, 0, 0. That should be it. If not, you probably did something else wrong along the way. I'm sorry I'm not explaining this too thoroughly. I'm just running out of steam on this whole project. But, yeah, that's basically it. You should be done. Overall, I'd say there's probably better ways to do some of these. I am not too experienced with Unity, so a lot of the Unity sections might be overcomplicated. There might be a much better way of doing them. The JSON overall, everything, I'm pretty sure I have down mostly to a science. I've made about almost 24 planes now, and I think I'm getting good at it. So, it's up to you to do with what you want with the JSON. If you want to make an unrealistic plane or a spaceship, go for it. Use the tools. I don't really know what else to say. Just, I hope this is helpful, and I might revise this video or make another to add and correct any mistakes or anything I missed with it. But otherwise, I guess that's it.